Pielo. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. It kind of echoes. It follows a flow.
That's the amazing thing, right? Like that's where it derives value from. It's like this new form of value and identity.
And the Renaissance was the recreation of the world as we knew it at the time.
NFTropico.
Hello and welcome to NFTropico, a podcast exploring the intersection between blockchain and culture. Today we have with us Josh Rosenthal. The first time I heard Josh was on a Bankless episode called the Cryptorenaissance. On this episode, Josh brings forward the idea of crypto technologies being something similar to the printing press and bringing forward a new era in civilization, much like the printing press did with the Renaissance back in the day. I firmly believe this idea to be true. I'm very passionate about it as well, and I really hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I did recording it. Just a reminder, there will be an open mint for 1 week after this episode air on a piece of art inspired by the conversation today. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome to NFTropico. It's an honor really to have you. I think anyone who knows me, I've spoken about you on this crypto renaissance theory. This show is about NFTs in particular, so that's my corner of this whole crypto world. And yeah, why don't you give us a brief introduction on what this crypto renaissance theory is, or like what's the idea behind it?
Yeah. So I'm very much a historian more than just into crypto, and one of the periods in history that I really focused on was the shift between the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was the recreation of the world as we knew it at the time. And when I kind of look at those periods of history, I always look at kind of three big, threads I pull on. And one is value, how people, accumulate value or share value or use value, money, but it's more than that. And then also communication, how they're able to talk to each other and share ideas. And then also identity, how they think about themselves and their relationships to other people in the world, and what forms that takes, whether it's companies or guilds or local communities or things like that. And in the Middle Ages, all of that was centralized. It was a hierarchy. It was a big pyramid and a triangle where there were authority figures and institutions at the top, and then it trickled down all the way to you. So you in the Middle Ages, you couldn't really even own money. You didn't have access to money. There wasn't enough coin. There was, land and animals, but that probably wasn't for you. And with communication, you couldn't read, you couldn't write, and if you had an idea, you couldn't really share it. It was difficult. There were only manuscripts, handwritten documents, and they're very expensive and very difficult to share and distribute. So ideas were very limited. And if you had an idea to change that, you probably wouldn't be able to share your ideas quick enough or be able to finance different ideas. It just wasn't possible to change. And so I kind of looked at what happened. And what happened was there was a creation of two technologies at the same time. And the first was this financial technology, which sounds really odd and esoteric, but it was this double entry bookkeeping. It was a ledger, basically, with debits and credits and balances and counterbalances. And that unlocked finance, not just for a select few at the top, but for essentially everyone. That allowed you to make and receive loans, even if you didn't have money and you couldn't read or write. You'd keep a little ledger, and so all of a sudden you could do other things besides working as a laborer on a farm. You could open a business or do something like that. But how would you get that idea to do something else? Where would that ever occur to you? At the same time, there was the invention of the printing press, and the printing press. Some people say it's the internet, but I don't think it's so much the internet. I actually think it's Web3, because you were able to create things and own those things too. And so, even if you couldn't read or write, you were able, most of the things that were printed at the time, they weren't books and they weren't letters. Most of the things that were printed were images. They were images using this new technology. It was, a wood cut or a copper etching, and they printed out thousands of them. And these pictures weren't just pretty. these pictures conveyed ideas, and these ideas were radical. They were revolutionary. The ideas said, hey, this hierarchy that you're at the bottom of, the world doesn't have to be that way. You could do something else. There were different ways for arranging yourself in relationship to other people. And so it was completely radical. Those two technologies, they're both distributed or decentralized. There wasn't a single choke point that could shut it down. And when communities started using that, they essentially used those two things together to recreate their world. This is the beginning of, entrepreneurialism, small business, proto-mercantilism. It means you could quit being a laborer and open up your own shop and do your own thing, which was wild. And the technology was also generative. The technology created the community, and the community changed history. You might not be able to read or write before the technology, but when you started interacting with the technology, it taught you things, and you learned things, and you thought about things differently. And I should also say the technology, like the values and identity, were baked into the technology. And so even that art looked weird and odd. It wasn't like what you had seen before. It looked really weird to the people who were at the top of the pyramid. But because it was generative, it was anti-fragile. They couldn't stop it. And so, they could try to stop it, and they fought very hard to try to stop it. But over the long arc of history, they weren't able to stop it. And so they were faced with a choice. They could either keep fighting, or they could eventually embrace it and start to use it themselves. And that's what they chose. And so when I look at crypto, so I'm a historian, PhD in history. I'm reading those manuscripts, but I've also built a couple companies too around artificial intelligence and sold one to an MIT spin out. And so when I was looking at crypto after we sold our last company, we're figuring out what to do and looking at different technology, I was struck by crypto. It was using the same ledger, the same financial primitives, debit and credit, a ledger, which was very, very similar to the shift I'd seen. And then also this creation of the printing press was really what we call Web3 today. I was struck by how similar, even down to the code, it looks the same. And so I definitely see us as, finance and control of communication, and even who you are and what you could do. It's very hierarchical again. History kind of ticks and talks, and it was hierarchical in the Middle Ages, and then became decentralized in the Renaissance when they recreated the world, and then it kind of built up into another pyramid again, and we're like in the Middle Ages again. And so now we're using this technology and experiencing it, and I think it's going to unwind and recreate the world as we know it in a nutshell, which is a bold claim to make, but it has very, very specific similarities. And a couple other nuances on that, I guess I could talk about. We think we have the printing press because we have the internet. You and I just remember the internet. But in history, there are these things called false forks. You try something and it goes for a while, and then it stops and it goes back, and they try it again. And this happens many, many, many times, and eventually one works. And I think the current internet is kind of like that. It's we've gone down this false fork where people have control, and now with Web3, we're unlocking it. And so I think when people look back, they'll think of crypto as being the internet. They'll think of crypto as being art and identity. They'll think of crypto as being money, and they probably won't even say the word crypto. It probably won't even occur to them. And so there were many, many renaissances all before the last one. And the last one succeeded because communities use these two types of technology, and they're essentially, ledger-based finance is our, tokens and blockchain today, and printing press is our Web3 today. The difference is, and the unique thing about this renaissance is we have a third thing, and that third thing is the NFT. That third thing is digital ownership of either digital assets or real-world assets. And so the choke point in the Renaissance last time was you could have an idea and you could share it. You could have money and you could share it, but you could never own something. If you tried to own something, you still had to interact with someone in control somewhere. There was a court, or you had to go to a place and file a claim. And so that was a good choke point to kind of stop things and build back up that aggregation. And so NFTs are new in the sense that it's distributed ownership. And I think that's that's incredibly radical and different than anything we've seen before. And just one last thing with the printing press and the finance, we think of it as like analog, right? We think of a book as being the oldest form of media you can have. It's not interesting. It's old hat, right? But at the time, it was crazy. It was their metaverse. It was synthetic. Before that, you didn't really read, and then all of a sudden you would read, and you'd go someplace else, and you'd be in that place for a while and not really pay attention to what's going on here. And you'd come back from that place. And in that place, you'd interact with ideas and you'd learn things, and you'd come back and you would have that knowledge and you'd have those ideas. So that was like magic to them. That was their metaverse. And so the unique thing about NFTs is not only this digital ownership, but I don't see them as, fighting things in real life. I see them just like what happened with printing. It reinforces what happens in real life. They're like doorways. They're two-directional doorways. You can go into the synthetic world, do things there, come back into the real world. You can work in the metaverse, come back and enjoy the fruits and the rewards here, or work here and enjoy the fruits there. So long story short, every few hundred years you have these epic transformations, and AI will probably be part of that, just like the internet and things like that. But the really interesting part is the decentralized technology. When communities use decentralized technology, they tend to remake history. So that's the thesis, that we're at the very beginning of another renaissance. How about that?
That's amazing, Josh. There's so much to unravel there. I'd like to start with like the this notion of historical processes, because we get the sense like, and it has occurred to me over and over, like we sense like, okay, the Renaissance, like it was one day and it happened, and of like the next day we were like, oh, this is beautiful and this is art and we're free, and maybe like whenever I think like, oh, why hasn't Web3 taken over the world and NFTs and stuff, like I tend to remember, maybe these are processes that like there's a lot of friction to unravel, and there's maybe you can shine a light on like what's the friction right now, like what's government positions on this, and maybe not get like not anti-establishment or libertarian, but like what are the forces at play right now in the transition for this new renaissance?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. No, and it's a really good point too. We look back and we think, it just happened instantly, right? And we say, oh, it must have been so fun to be there at that time. It would have been great. I would have loved it. It would have felt really good, but it didn't. They thought their world was ending. Everything they knew about their reality was coming apart at the seams. Their money would be worth something and then not worth something, and worth something and not worth something. The institutions they relied on, they were coming apart at the seams. They thought it was literally the end of their world, and they weren't wrong. Their world was being recreated in a way that they couldn't imagine it, and it took a long time. It was unpleasant, and there were fights, and there was friction, and there were unintended consequences. Like when you see that kind of friction, that doesn't mean it won't work. It actually means that it's probably like really substantive. It's powerful. It's transformative. And that process, it tends to follow this path or this playbook. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. It kind of echoes. It follows a flow. And it starts with like finance, because that's the most valuable. And then it moves into kind of art and identity, because that tells you who you are in relationship to that. And then it moves into kind of corporation and governance and what we'd call DAOs today, how you work together. And then into education, that's propagation for the future and the next people building on it. And then finally into this interaction with, the real world. So there's this kind of flow to the whole thing. And right now we're just in the very, very beginnings of it. We see it with tokens. We have, some NFTs, but it's still like so early. It's like the first innings. We haven't even taken the field to play yet. We're just starting this. And so it's a super good point. When you see friction, in fights, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean it won't work. Every time any recreation has happened, it's been out of like a birth of a fight, basically. And so this kind of follows like what you would sort of expect to happen. And honestly, the people who control the institutions, they fight, and they fight hard, and that's kind of their job. Like bureaucracy, you can get mad at it and not like it, but it has a job. Its job is to make sure that things don't change. Its job is to preserve the status quo. That's what it's designed to do, right? Like it's a feature. It's not a bug. And so when you're threatened with change, it's going to fight using every means possible, some fair and some unfair, every way they possibly can. The thing about it is, and the bet is that the technology, because it's distributed and when communities use it, it's generative. It has a life of its own. It creates. It's like Jurassic Park, like Jeff Goldblum says, hey, life finds a way. It creates. With the printing press, they wanted to stop it, right? They wanted to stop it all the time. They got together, the cities, and they said, you're not allowed to print. And they tried to stop it in every way they possibly could, because the people holding the keys, the authority figures, didn't want, divergent messages and ideas getting out. The problem was, because it's decentralized, anyone can do it. You can stop it, you can regulate it, you can do other things, but because anyone can actually do it, you can fork it. It's very difficult for someone to stop that. And so over time, they'll try, and eventually it won't work, and then they'll adopt it. At a certain point, people using the technology, it becomes too valuable to ignore. It becomes too valuable to fight against, in terms of forbidding it. And then the fight changes. The fight turns to trying to co-opt it and run it. That's like usually the next phase of it. And it tends to really radically transform not just communities, but societies, even like politically, nothing to do with modern politics, but whatever any given current landscape is, conservative, liberal, on fiscal or social, however you want to do it, it doesn't matter. It's like an X and Z on a grid. And now you're introducing this new thing. You're introducing 3D. You're introducing like a Z axis. And, your previous enemies might now be on the same side of this, right? And your previous friends might be on the other side of it. It shifts everything around. And during that time, it's very, very chaotic. And that's kind of the time we're getting into. In terms of like, it's kind of like your enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's like you can try to ban stuff, but you might ban it in any given country, but when other countries start using it and using it very effectively, and all of the talent and the intellect and the money goes out of it, you can't continue to ban it. And we've seen this story all throughout history across hundreds of years. And even in recent memory, like we've seen this again and again and again. Like, they in the United States, we fought encryption. We didn't want anyone to use encryption, right? This was like subject of great debate, which meant you couldn't send an email or you couldn't send an online payment, and it was craziness. And we fought that. In the United States, we tried to have our post office send your email. We didn't want you to be able to send an email from your computer. Like we do this stuff all the time. We kind of forget about it, and then we wanted to tax email. But the technology, it's like a tectonic plate. It doesn't lend itself well to that. And so this is just kind of what everyone does every time there's something new on the scene. It's not pleasant. It's like definitely like irritating and frustrating and unnerving, but it's definitely expected. This is what happens. The other thing I'll say is, like, in the early points where new technology comes on, there's like the true believers and kind of the zealots and the early adopters. And that's great. You need kind of people that are almost crazy to be into it, because otherwise it wouldn't work, right? Who else is going to do it? But over time, like, it becomes the new normal. And so, like, when you introduce a new thing, it basically, some people think, oh, I did this old thing and now I introduce this new thing and I can only do the new thing. That's not the way that's not the way the playbook works. The pattern is, it's almost like a spectrum. There was just one thing, and now you introduced a new thing. And it doesn't mean everybody goes over to it. It means instead there's all these places on the spectrum. It opens up design space for all sorts of possibilities, and different people work in different spaces in different ways. That tends to be the way that works out. So like right now we're at the point where we don't really understand what all those spaces will be. So we're kind of, fighting it, and we'll try to ban it, and we'll try to overregulate it. But if history repeats, there'll be, very, very open, decentralized pieces. There'll be more centralized pieces, and there'll be all sorts of things in between, just like there is with every technology.
That's pretty cool. I was thinking, like, when hearing you speak, like, it's always amazing how, like, we always kind of get the sense of the direction or where these processes are going, but we never like quite put our fingers on the expected outcome. So I was thinking about like when NFTs first came to place, right? Like everybody was expecting, yeah, it's gonna be gaming, right? And like it's gonna be gaming, and everyone, that's the thing that's gonna change the world. And boom, gamers hate NFTs, right? And then these art things and these profile pictures, and everyone's like, no, it's gonna be me and this punk and whatnot. And suddenly we have these memes, right? Like what the punk 6529 things did. It's like, it's amazing. Like, and we find these devices of communication, and at least my personal stance on it's like, I'm not marrying to any specific trend. I'm not just like out there and rooting for everyone and like looking forward to like, okay, what's gonna make a dent in society? Like what's gonna be embraced? Like what use are gonna people find in it?
Yeah, it tends to like, so a way to kind of think about it is there's like one model to have in your mind is there when you have new technology, there tends to be, and communities use it, there's kind of two unfolds, or there's two unlocks. And the first unlock is where you apply the technology to the same stuff you had before, and you make it kind of better and faster and cheaper, but it's the same thing. You know, it's the technology applied to the old thing. It just polishes up a little bit. And then after a while, people look at the technology and say, oh, I can now do things I couldn't have otherwise done before, things I couldn't have even thought of before, right? That's why the idea of like art and ideas are so important, because that gives you the second unlock. It allows you to do things you couldn't have otherwise done. It's like, you know, if you have Wi-Fi and you're running a cab, you know, at the internet, it's like, okay, I can use my cell phone and now I can receive and pick up fares or whatever. And then they're like, oh, maybe I could do something with Uber and I don't need the cab company. It's like the thing you couldn't have imagined before, just hopping in someone's car. And so like, that's kind of the idea, is that it opens up these new things that you couldn't otherwise imagine. So early on, it's kind of the same stuff. It's like, oh, use NFTs for all the stuff we had before, for games, for pictures, for blah, 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 blah. And then in the next phase, because there's something truly unique about it, it opens up for things that you and I like aren't quite capable of thinking about now, stuff we wouldn't imagine. But after the fact, it'll be super obvious. You'll go, oh, we should have done that. And that's one of the reasons why it's like NFTs and ownership of the stuff you create. It's really, really important, because it gives that, instead of being in a financial hierarchy or pyramid, when I say we're medieval now, like, I mean, like you and I are very similar to our medieval twins way back when. Your medieval twin wouldn't have known that they were at the bottom of a pyramid. That sounds crazy, but they wouldn't have been aware of it, right? Just like, you know, you can't spend your money the way you want to. If you have a trading account, you don't actually own it. A company gives you a digital IOU. If you want to purchase something on a credit card, you know, I've had a credit card say, I'm not going to let you go to this event on my credit card because it's about crypto and I don't like that idea. Like, you're limited in all these ways, right? And the same thing with a communication on a platform. They can deplatform you, or they can just show you little pieces of what you want to see. You don't have real access to the algorithm. When you search in Colombia and I search in the US, we see very different results, right? Because like all of that is they're optimizing you for everybody to see the same thing. Like total addressable market, at least in the United States, the growth has been in the stock market, and the stock market's really been around like a few companies, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, like Netflix, like just a few of them. And they make the most money when everybody watches the same thing, buys the same thing, thinks the same thing, sees the same thing. Like total addressable market pushes everyone to the same idea. And so it's very difficult to have different ideas about what the world could be. And so by being able to pull off pieces of that have their own economies, you know, if it's punks or whatever you want to, now all of a sudden there's an economy around different ideas, like minority ideas, divergent ideas. And that's super important, not just for people and for cultures and communities, but it's important because it's those weird ideas that unlock the next, you know, evolution of what could possibly be. So it's super important. And the meme, like you mentioned, is really, really a core piece of that. Like the idea that you can take an image or, you know, a short little video, you can take a snippet, and it's a symbol and it's semiotic. It means something more than the image itself. It is a radical idea or a different way of doing it. And then having a mimetic or a monetary or an economic value on it only makes it like more and more powerful. That's the way kind of humans like use and interact with technology to create and share these ideas, by putting them into images or pictures that have value and like the ability to share these things back and forth. And so memes, like NFTs right now, it's like silly pictures. Okay, fine. But they're not just silly pictures. It's just like the printing presses. Images look weird to our expectations, but they're incredibly powerful because they unlock these new ideas that are outside of that TAM, that open up the world that'll become that we can't even imagine. Just like medieval you couldn't imagine the world today. That's like literally what's happening right now.
That's amazing, Joshua. Like when the interview first began, you were saying something that I like. It struck a chord with me, and like, okay, there's something really interesting here in the sense of these items that have different like value, communication, and there's like identity. Like since you said those three words, like boom, immediately my mind went into NFTs. And pre-recording this interview, I shared you an email where I said like, okay, so one of the things I'm most interested about NFTs is like I really don't understand what's there, right? Like I can get a sense of, you say these words and like, yeah, that means something to me, and like that's definitely an NFT. Like, but if you say like, okay, Camille, like put it down or something, I wouldn't be able to. And I get the sense like maybe it translates into this chaos you were talking about. Like there are these notions that are happening, but like I don't really know where they're going. I don't know if anyone does, but like it's like we're just living this chaotic like new dimension, like
No.
XYZ
Yeah.
axis, right?
Yeah, it's like right now, it's like you're in the Middle Ages and someone handed you a ledger, a little notebook that says you can actually have money and share money. And like, it's important, but you don't quite know. You haven't seen someone say, hey, you can get off the farm and you can go open up a shop and actually set up as a merchant. You know it's important, but you can't quite picture what this will happen. Or someone hands you, a little broadsheet, a picture, a crazy image on it, and it has this tag, and you're like, wow, you haven't seen a picture like this before, and it has these ideas that never occurred to you, and like it's important, but you haven't yet learned how to use it, where you can use it to share information, to go somewhere else, to create a different world. You don't quite know how that works, and so you're holding these things, and somehow they're important, and that's fine. You don't need to know how it works out. That's the part you're in the story right now. It's important, but you don't know kind of how it works out. I mean, the identity piece is like really, really important, even with those like when I was talking about the internet kind of being a false fork, like you go down it's like, Betamax or, a cassette tape or something like that. And then you're like, no, we're going to go to the next thing. And part of that is when we first did the internet, we couldn't persist state. The computers weren't powerful enough, and we didn't have the protocols where you could keep your own identity. The only open protocols, technical protocols, were email protocols and HTTP like links. The idea of persisting who you are, your login and your password, there's no way to save that. And so you outsource that's your identity, right? When you log into Riverside or Google or whatever, you're like typing in, it's like, hey, I'm Camillo and here's my password, Fluffy, blah, blah, blah. Like that's who you are in this digital world, right? But you don't own that, like, because in the early internet, we couldn't own that. We couldn't persist it. So we gave it away to these companies to persist it for us. Apple and Google, like they own that thing, basically. You gave that to them, not just the picture. The picture is the easy way for us to understand that identity, but it's actually that identity. It's just like when you use a computer and you put files in the trash can. There is no trash can. That's like just a picture for you to like get it in your head. The same thing with your picture of your punk or your cat or whatever you're using, or your ape. The important thing is that identity. And like we gave that away to Google and to Apple and to everybody else. And like, just because we had to in the internet, we didn't have the right framework. We were on the wrong fork. And so what happened was that identity is linked to data. And that data is how the world has made money, how every technology company has made money, how the US stock market has created wealth, has been over that data tied to your identity. Google doesn't make money off search. Google makes money off your identity leaving a data trail that they sell, basically, right? Every entity, there's a little bit of subscription, but it's mostly data. Data is gold that you create for whoever holds your identity, and you don't own your identity. You're creating gold for these other companies. You're creating massive value, but you don't own any of that because you don't have your identity. And so that's why they've become multi-billion-dollar companies, and their stock market goes through, and you can use something for free maybe, or you pay a little bit of money for it. It's like it's very out of whack. And so that identity is super important. Like, they control your identity. If you say something you don't like, they ban you and you're done. Like, and so what are you going to do? You can try to create a new identity, but they might know it's you because they're tying it to an IP address. And so the point is, like, you've lost your identity, you've lost your data, you've lost the value it creates, you've lost the ability to communicate around it. And now all of a sudden you have these two things in your hand. And like, in the new world, like, this will let you not only keep your identity and keep the data that you can choose to share or not share. And if you choose to share, you can get paid for sharing that. You can choose to create and have your creations tied to your identity, and you own the fruits of that. Or you can choose to project your identity or go anonymous, or reproject your identity or go anonymous, or have multiple identities. It's a very different world. The core thing to think about is, like, yeah, you're right. We have these things in our hands. We know they're important. We don't know how it's going to work out yet. But we do know that the last time people controlled it and we gave it away, it was incredibly valuable, and we didn't share in those rewards. How about that?
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I think you also touched something that's really interesting, like all over your work and your speech. Like, and it's this notion that finance is super tied into, like, the or at least the economics of it all are, like, tied into both the art and, like, the identity. Like, it's almost like a layer that's on top of everything. And, like, that's, like, again, that's something, like, when I first heard it, I was like, oh, yeah, that makes so much sense. But, like, that's something I didn't grow up understanding, right? Like the world around me does not work like that, right? Like, art is this thing, finance bros hanging their walls, or like super rich people, like, and I'd like to have your perspective on, like, what's this layer of finance on everything.
Yeah. So I mean, these kind of cultural, these recreations or these renaissances, these reworkings of all of society, it's when communities use decentralized technology, and it tends to start in finance. It almost just has to, because if you don't have finance, you can't have time dedicated to work on it. You can't easily attract other people. You can't. It's the most valuable piece of it. So it always starts with the greatest value, and so, like, it almost has to start there. But it's not like you're just even in the last Renaissance, we talk about, the Medici or these, rich people, and we say, oh, they made a bunch of money and then they just bought some art and hung it on their walls. That wasn't what they did. Like, they made money by using this new technology, and then they used the art not just to display wealth, but to change values, to change what people thought was important, which is crazy. Like, in the Middle Ages, like, their world was there was the religious and there's everything else. And only the religious was worthwhile. Everything else in this world, me, you, your neighbor, your friends, your family, not worthwhile. And so when, like, even the Medici recreated this art, they pulled in different ideas and different concepts which weren't valuable before, and they put them in art and assigned value to it. And now all of a sudden, not just those pieces of art, but the idea that's connected with a piece of art, the semiotic link, is valuable. Like, that's why you see, the picture of fruit everywhere. You're like, wait, it's this bowl of fruit. Why do I care? Because the idea is that the everyday thing that you have every day, it's actually valuable and it's meaningful and it's worthwhile. And, like, the real stuff just isn't off in a monastery or with a monk or nun. The real stuff, that can be important too, but just as important is, like, you here with your job and with your neighbor and with your friends and with your family. That's important and meaningful too. That sounds obvious to us today, but that would have been, like, radical to you at the time. And so by them using this art and pulling in things like different classical things and stuff that they hadn't seen before, and the everyday stuff, they were, in assigning it value, they were saying, hey, this stuff is actually valuable. It's worthwhile for you to do these different things in this world and, like, help other people. It's, like, completely radical. And, like, it ties to identity, because, like, your identity isn't just, like, money based. Like, you can think of it in one way, like, where you spend your time and where you spend your attention is like, in order for you to spend time and attention, you have to be able to know it's you. You have to be able to put a stake in the ground and say, hey, that's me. And other people have to be able to say, hey, that's Camilo. And you have to be able, everybody has to know that. And then when you're there, then you can spend money, and then you can communicate, and then you can do other things. But like owning that stake in the ground where you control it and no one can take it away, it's super important. It'd be like buying a building or building a business where it could go away at any time. You have to be able to have that stake in the ground. So yeah, it's money and it's ideas, but it's also all the other stuff that NFTs are tied to, is this like digital ownership of either digital things like pictures, but NFTs are also digital rights for physical things too, right? And that's how they started, as like real estate. And so like that can be experience, or that can be expertise, or that can be education, or that can be, think about everything that like makes you who you are in the world. Like it could be a picture that represents you. It could be a bank account. It could be a diploma. It could be a portfolio of things you've done. Like all of those things can now be associated online with you and your identity on chain. And so that's like, you don't need a certificate of like graduation from a college or a university. Like that can literally be an NFT on chain associated with you. And so now you have a portfolio of not just money and not just images and different things, like, but every part about you. And that allows you to build connections with other people who either have economic interest to transact with you, or ideological, like, or shared images and shared values that you both think are important and you're working for. Like all of that isn't going through a third party that can cut the cord. Now you can hold it and you can control it. And so you can build meaningful communities and connections in ways you couldn't before, either economic or whatever intellectual or social, experiment you want to try.
That's beautiful, Josh. So maybe like what I'm taking from here is like, okay, so maybe these new forms of art that kind of like when you say generative art, that's not new, but like this new era of generative art, or like A art, Clear Silver or Snow Thrower, like maybe like the when there's value attached to it, like financial value, it's a sense of like, hey, listen, this is important. And like all this friction we're getting from like the establishment, and I don't mean this like, I know it's been adopted or whatever, like when people say like, yeah, that's not art, that's done by a machine or whatever. It's like, and it's quite, that's the amazing thing, right? Like that's where it derives value from. It's like this new form of value and identity, and this new set of morals that are taking over the world and are like, yeah, that's amazing. That's it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's almost like this pinching effort. There's one way you can look at it and you can say, hey, these images, if you have like, I don't know, a Nike logo or a Mercedes logo or something, you can say, hey, I see this logo and I know it's important and it conveys these different like ideas of just value. Okay, that's fine. But there's also like flags and religious images and social images and like community images. And these things are like, they're important because they tie people together, and people are now able to work economically with one another, like a guild or like a company or however you want to describe it. Like even the logos for like, fractional ownership of like companies, like the stock market, all this is like fractionalized. Like it could be that kind of thing. But more fundamental than that, so in that sense, like a logo is just kind of boring. Like people can't understand the idea of like identity. It's too abstract. It's too philosophical. It's too, you just can't figure it out. It doesn't make any sense. So you almost need a picture to simplify it. So in that sense, having these super simple pictures, it's actually great. It makes it easy. Like the value isn't in that picture. The value is like that you control it and you own it. For the first time, you could never own anything digital before. Like your great grandkids will say, "Come on, tell me a story when you guys didn't own anything." It'll be like you trying to talk to a medieval farmer and say, "Hey, wait, you didn't own the land, you just worked on it? That's pretty stupid." And they'll be like, "Wait, you could own a piece of property, but you couldn't own like the digital thing you created? How's that work?" Like it's just so like now you can actually like own this stuff and like put your stake in the ground and have these connections. And like the fact that the art is simple or that it looks weird, like the value, like art isn't a function of like how long it took you to paint something or like labor hours. Like, oh, it took me 2 hours, so it's worth twice as much as 1 hour. That's like not the way like it works. Like even one way to think about it is like medieval you'd never seen art. right? You just never seen it. You can say, oh, I went to church and I saw this picture. Like you hadn't seen that. That never happened. That was for like very, very select few. So you hadn't seen anything like that. The first time you've really seen anything like that is you have this picture, and that picture, there's a lot of criticism coming out of the printing press for the picture because they thought, oh, that's artificial, that's synthetic, it's so easy. They stamp it, make the next one, stamp it, make the next one, stamp it, make the next one. But art, it isn't zero sum. It isn't like a smaller and smaller and smaller piece of the pie. What happened was that art became more valuable because it had these ideas, and like it created like value and community. It was generative. It was like, you know, the Jurassic Park idea, basically. It created out of it. So you've now seen this for the first time and you can own it, and it actually conveys something very important. It conveys like an idea of like who you are in the world, your relationship to other people, and your relationship to like what's meaningful for you to undertake. That's like, there's nothing more significant about that. And you've now seen it, and there's an artifact of this that you can actually hold and like share. The value is in what it means for who you are and what you'll do with your life and how you'll work with others, like not in how many hours it took you. And like, it's always the same story. It was the same thing, like, oh, it's not valuable anymore. Like, you know, I had to handwrite a document that took me years to do, and now I printed it. Does that mean it's less valuable? No, the value of like printed material increased, of literacy increased. Like it actually created literacy and created interaction. And now you're on a computer. Like it doesn't make it less valuable. It makes the pie bigger. That's what it means to like generate. And so it's not just the image, it's like what the image means and the connections of that. And like, that's an easy way to think about it philosophically, or just purely materially. It's like, it's like an image of like what you can own and what you can participate. You can actually like have a piece of something and own something, which sounds super simple, but like you weren't able to do that before. You just never knew you weren't able to do that. So that's like really, really fundamental. Is that helpful?
Yeah, super helpful. I was like, and on this same train of thought, like, where do we go from here, right? Like, I get the sense that we're like in the middle of this push and pull, and like, what are you looking at? Like, where's your attention from here?
Oh man. So like I'm looking at kind of three really specific. So I think there's like this path that it tends to follow. It starts in finance, and then it goes into art and identity, and then it goes into like how you work together. We'd call them DAOs today, or some form of that. You know, you can even think of it historically. There was no company before, right? Only a few people controlled everything. There was no limited liability company. You had to only work with your friends and your family, because anybody else would sue you, and that meant you couldn't own a share of whatever company. There was no stock market. And so when they introduced fractional ownership even in the market, like everybody thought it would be horrible. And what it did was it opened up all this stuff. And so I think this idea of like fractional ownership, like tied not just to images, but fractional ownership where everything in the real world actually goes on chain. Instead of your ownership, instead of being on a letter in a lawyer's office or something, it actually goes on chain. So right now, NFTs are just digital assets is what we mostly think about, but they're the digital shell. They're the digital wrapper for anything, for either digital assets or real world assets. And they're the connection for you to be able to financialize that, and without having to go to a bank or without having to deal with someone making a decision for you, like based on who you are or what they know about you. So like I'm looking at all the real world stuff coming on chain. I think that's like super important. That's like one very big piece of it. I also think like the education and experience and expertise, all of that, what makes you, not just your login and your picture, but all of the stuff that you do that you say is important, that you want to keep and control. I think that's like going to be a huge piece of it. The governance stuff is like super important too. Like one of the things that like the digital thing lets you do is simulation. So like my kids, you know, they don't learn through like a school. They learn by playing a game and doing a simulation again and again and again and again. And so like the problem was we were never able to do governance or representation or how you make decisions as groups and communities, not even political, but just anything, because we didn't have like the digital rails to do that. And so like this idea of like distributed ownership and smart contracts and like stuff running on code instead of in letters, it lets us experiment in a sandbox with like governance in ways we couldn't do before. Instead of representativism and republicanism or everybody one person, one vote, now you can do quadratic voting, or you can do it weighted by by your experience, your expertise. Instead of just having to do a blast, you can pick out and search for very particular people. I think that's like going to be a very particular like thing. And the other thing I'm like really interested, I know it's kind of trendy now, but like this idea of DPIN, or decentralized physical infrastructure networks, I think that's like super important. And that being on chain and wrapped as an NFT. And so like, if you think about all the stuff I'm talking about, it being decentralized, there's still a couple choke points on it. One choke point on it is your device, your phone, right? It still has to go through iOS and Apple, or through Google and Android. And then the other choke point on it is the broadcast. Who's running your internet, and how are you doing that? And those are two big choke points that they can shut down at any point in time. And we're starting to see like mobile stacks being built on that, different devices which are native that let you use that, like Solana SMS as a mobile stack as an example on a Saga phone, where you don't have to go through Apple or Google, completely decentralized and distributed. So now my phone isn't a choke point anymore. And very fundamentally, that broadcast layer of the Web3 stack, not just the data layer and the indexing layer and the asset layer and the finance layer, but the broadcasting layer, I think, is super important. And so you're starting to see projects like that, where those broadcast nodes, like they are NFTs. Like I use Helium to broadcast a signal all over the place, and it's actually an NFT, that broadcast layer. And like, in Mexico, there's like a Oxio is on top of it, right? So they're providing like private, like, not just VPNs, but like private broadcast, cell like infrastructure and Wi-Fi infrastructure. So that idea of like using NFTs for like real world physical infrastructure, that's kind of what I was talking about, that two-way doorway. Right now we say, oh, the real stuff's here and NFTs are just digital pictures of cats. No, NFTs are going to be these bridges which like work back and forth. So I think that's going to be super important too. Does that make sense? That's a lot of stuff to throw at you.
Josh, it's amazing. It really is like it does open this conceptual door. Like, yeah, we think about these cats and these fidences and whatever, and then you get the sense of like, okay, yeah, but it's also these broadcasting stations and these nodes for right. So like these assets for that denote property, and like all these sorts of things are amazing.
Yeah, one other thing I'd say that I think is really important and really worth thinking about is like, if that lets like the little guy, the small business owner, like, if you're running a coffee shop and you're paying 5% to American Express to process a transaction, and you're paying a mortgage, and like you can almost like everything in Web 2 is a expense, right? It's a cost center. You could go through and say, what's the Web 3 version of this, right? And that becomes revenue generation. I'll use a crypto payment and get auto staking on it. So instead of paying 5%, I'll get 5%. So that's a 10% swing. Like if you're running a coffee shop here, I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, that's a difference between staying open and closing, or hiring an extra cook or barista. Or if I'm paying rent and I'm running like even like the broadcast layer, right? I'm earning off of that just for using electricity I wouldn't otherwise do. Like not proof of work, but like nothing basically, right? Just using my location to broadcast, right? So now I'm getting, some money from doing that, and that helps pay my rent. Like that lets me keep my doors open. So I think all of that like stuff you used to pay for, you able to earn, is like super important. And what it means for you as an individual, I think data DAOs are going to be really, really important. This kind of gets back to what I was saying about you create all this data, you never owned your identity, so you just give it away. Companies make money off it. That's the way the modern like tech stack works. But now if you control your identity, like, and you can control your data on chain, you can get paid to share that data, and like not just to share it to give it to a company, but you can potentially be able to share it within the community in ways that don't have silos. And that means you get paid for using your data and sharing your data. And different companies and DAOs that are doing it, like, use it to make products. And those products are better than they would otherwise be able to make, because, with a de-identified world, your credit card data is here, your IP data is here, your blah, blah, blah data is here. If you control it, and you can keep it anonymous through an abstraction layer, ZK or whatever you want to use, all of a sudden you can like use that in a data DAO to get paid for sharing your data. And you can also use that like to get paid for like you get paid through ownership in that data now when they make products. Like here's an example. It sounds so like instead of in the United States, everybody uses like, you know, Robinhood or, you know, Fidelity or something to buy stuff. There's something called like Delphia, right? And like literally you go in there and like you're sharing your data, and like they're outperforming, like they have significant performance increases on like the market return, and you earn ownership in that protocol by sharing it. So that's like a real world example where you earn not by playing, you earn by like sharing. And instead of you paying money to use something or them front running you and like making margin off the delta, you're participating in it, you're sharing your data, you're earning as a result of that. And when everyone in the community shares their data, it creates a better product and like function than otherwise would have been able to do. That's something that anybody can do now. Just use that platform instead of some other platform, and you're earning out of that. That's like a really good example of you owning your data, owning your identity, owning your data, and getting incentivized for that. And that's a good example of it, like being something you otherwise couldn't have imagined. It's not just like they're looking at your data. It's just when everybody's contributing it and you're able to associate like all the hubs on the spoke, you're able to reconstruct it with, you know, better than sparse realization. You're able to create a better technical product out of it. Like, so there's real world examples like that. It's just super early, and we're going to try a bunch of things, and 9 out of 10 of them are going to fail, and all the failures will come first. And like the news, like it loves doing that basically. Like that's the one thing I would like to see, like out of that, like all the stuff being in one pyramid and being able to put it together. If crypto could do one thing, that I would love to see it over time, be able to create a new media model, basically, like where you're not incentivized just by like, you know, clicks and rage and what have you, but where you're incentivized, where there's like business models for doing like interesting things for small communities, you know, kind of like you guys are doing. Like, I think that's like the real opportunity, you know?
That is amazing, Josh. I'd like to kind of like close on the with the idea that like this change we're going through, like it really is going to affect us in ways we can't even imagine right now. Like, again, this when we speak, like we give it as a fact. Yeah, we say it over and over like a platitude, but like when you start to like pinning it down and giving like real life examples, it just clicks, right? It makes sense. It like always hearing you and speaking with you like reminds me of like, what's the emotional drive I see in this world, and like that, and then the new world that's coming. So I really appreciate you coming in the podcast, sir, and yeah, as always, amazing, and I hope to help you again in the future.
Okay, no, thanks so much, Camilo. I really appreciate it.
Hielo.